Welcome everybody to the webinar on renters preventing homelessness and COVID-19. This is part of the webinar series hosted by the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. I'm Maria Foscarinas. I'm founder and executive director of the Law Center, and really happy to welcome you all today to this really critically important topic. This is especially timely. Today is July 1. Rent is due for many people, but for many tenants, the pandemic coupled with the economic crisis may mean choosing between paying the rent and putting food on the table. And it may mean for many the threat of homelessness. So this is a critical topic. We're very happy to be able to focus on it today, and we have an impressive panel with us to help us discuss it, to help us understand the crisis, including its impact on people who are already disproportionately affected by both the housing crisis, the pandemic, and by homelessness. People of color, we know, are in the group that is most disproportionately affected. So we're very pleased to be able to talk about this, to highlight the issues, and also hopefully to talk about solutions and the work we can all do together. We're going to start by looking at the national picture with Sarah Sadian from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. She will give us an update on some recent successes in the House and the work that still needs to be done. And we will also then hear from Amanda Ndiri, the CEO of Funders Together to End Homelessness, who is a leader not only in the world of philanthropy and how do we get the resources to do our work, but also in bringing a racial equity lens to the work, centering racial equity in the work that we do on homelessness and housing and on the pandemic. We'll hear from John Pollock, who is the coordinator of the Right to Counsel Coalition, about the work that he and his group are doing on the right to counsel in eviction court in particular, and how that can be a powerful tool to really prevent people, low-income tenants, from being evicted into homelessness. So we are very glad for this panel. We had an additional panelist who is a local organizer, Victoria Gonsalves. We're not sure if she'll be joining us later. She may have been unavoidably delayed, but if not, we will be moving ahead with this panel and hope to hear from her another time. Organizing is really a critical piece, and we want to make sure that that's part of the conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tristia for some housekeeping and other important topics.
Thank you. Folks, Tristia Bauman, Senior Attorney at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. Thank you for joining us. Just a few initial matters. We will be recording the webinar. The slides will be available along with the recording on our website at www.nlchp.org. So if you miss something, you can always refer back to it there, and share the link, please, with your networks and your friends. Also, this is a 90-minute webinar. It's distinct from our prior webinars that were 60 minutes. We found that there was enough content and enough interest in Q&A that we were shortchanging the Q&A portion of the webinar. We want to make room for conversation at the end. So you'll hear presentations, and we have a 90-minute schedule today such that it should leave time for questions and answers. So you'll notice on the box that appears on the right-hand side of your screen that there is a questions tab. Please submit your questions there. Some of the questions may be answered in real time if they're ones that we can easily answer just by writing. If not answered there, then we will try to get to it during the question and answer period at the end, and you'll see me for that. Thank you. And with that, I turn it back over to Maria.
Great. Great, thank you, Tristia. Just a few words of introduction to frame our conversation. Before the pandemic, we had a housing crisis, an affordable housing crisis for decades in this country. In much of the country, housing costs have been skyrocketing while incomes have been stagnant, and inequality has been growing. So the pandemic did not create this crisis, but it has certainly made it much worse as unemployment has hit double digits and people who are already struggling are struggling even more. And it should come as no surprise that people of color are struggling disproportionately, are disproportionately affected, hardest hit by the housing crisis, the economic crisis, and COVID itself. Deep-seated, long-standing structural racism has led to this disparity and continues to drive it. So these are issues that are now being brought to the fore of the national conversation, thanks to the activism of millions of people and the leadership of Black Lives Matter. And we now have a critical opportunity for change, but we know that will not happen by itself. So we'll take the advocacy, the organizing, the efforts of all of us to really move this movement forward. But hopefully today we will learn some information, critical resources and tools to help us do that, and we know it will be an ongoing effort. So on the screen right now is a report that the Law Center published in 2018. Protect Tenants, Prevent Homelessness. I recommend it. It includes some resources and chapters by Tristia, who's the primary author, as well as guest authors, including John and others, on specific issues that are relevant to how we protect tenants in order to prevent homelessness, and also just addresses some of the racial equity issues. So it's on our website and it can serve as an additional resource. So with that, I would like to introduce Sarah. I'm very pleased to introduce Sarah Sadian of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, a critical partner and leader in this work. And Sarah will talk about recent developments at the federal level. So Sarah, take it away.
There we go. Thank you so much for having me. As Maria said, rent is due today on July 1st, and we already know that millions of people won't be able to afford to pay. Low-wage workers are losing their jobs the fastest in this pandemic, and they struggled the most to pay their rent even before this latest crisis hit. There's a patchwork of federal, state, and local eviction moratoriums that are in place that are giving some relief to some renters, but it leaves many people unprotected, and it's creating a financial cliff that many renters will fall off of when those moratoriums are lifted and back rent is owed. Without immediate federal action, we're very concerned that millions of renters, and disproportionately Black, Latino, and Native renters, will be evicted from their homes in the coming months and be at imminent risk of homelessness. Not only when they lose their homes, that means now with the pandemic that their own lives will also be at risk, because we know that housing is healthcare, and that the ability to stay home and stably housed is really important, especially now. Also, as Maria said, even before this pandemic, we were seeing that our national affordable housing crisis was reaching new heights. Over 500,000 people were experiencing homelessness on any given night, and 8 million of the very lowest income renters were paying at least half of their income on rent, which means that they were one financial crisis away from evictions and, in worst cases, homelessness. And for those renters, this pandemic may be that financial emergency that pushes them over the edge. We've already seen that about half of low-income households are reporting a sudden and recent decline in income or job loss. And in the first week of June, only 74% of renters in older, lower cost apartments were able to pay rent. And many of those who did pay rent paid rent either with one-time stimulus checks that were provided through the CARES Act, or they used credit cards. And both of those solutions aren't sustainable over the long run. On top of that, we're starting to see state and local eviction moratoriums rapidly expiring, and courts are beginning to address a backlog of eviction cases. As of today, at least by my count, 26 states have allowed their eviction moratoriums to expire, and by August 3rd, another 9 states will expire. And while some states have cobbled together resources from the CARES Act to provide some rental assistance or to avoid some evictions, what we're seeing is that those programs have to shut down within hours, if not days, because their funds are being depleted so quickly, because demand is just overwhelming the resources that are out there. All of this points to the need for significant federal intervention, or there's going to be a wave of evictions and a spike in homelessness across the country. And we're starting to see that already take place, and we're really concerned that Congress is taking too long to provide these resources, and that there's going to be real harm. There's continuing to be real harm that will be unpreventable if Congress takes too long to pass these resources. So just to give you a sense of what we're seeing across the country, we know that in Miami, 50% of renters don't think that they can make July 1st rent. And there's about 2,600 eviction cases that have already been filed in the state. In Hawaii, 21,000 renters are at risk of losing their home. 7,500 of them are considered to be at extreme risk. And there's a backlog of 800 cases that are starting to be processed. In Ohio, because they didn't have an eviction moratorium, they're continuing to move through with so many eviction filings that they had to move their court proceedings to a convention center. The census says that about 500,000 Ohio residents didn't pay their rent last month, including households with about 336,000 children. Oklahoma has more than 1,200 cases pending just in one county, and they've already started moving forward last month with those cases. Michigan has 75,000 eviction cases that they expect will be filed. New York City is expecting 60,000 cases. Pennsylvania is expecting, they had a rental assistance program. 13,000 households applied, but only 4,000 were able to get any sort of help. And in Texas, about 40% of renters in Houston say they don't think they'll be able to make rent, and their $15 million rent relief fund ran out in 90 minutes. So all of this is pointing to a national problem that is happening right now. It points to the immediacy of this situation and the real need for Congress to take action. So what is it that Congress can do that would make a real impact here? First, we think Congress needs to pass immediately a uniform national moratorium on evictions for the duration of this public health crisis. This resource or this provision was passed by the House in the HEROES Act, and it was introduced as a standalone bill from Senator Warren and 17 Senate Democrats, called the Protecting Renters from Evictions and Fees Act. But we know that eviction moratoriums aren't enough on their own, and that we need financial assistance to help renters pay their back end debt. Otherwise, they'll end up with more debt, and some of our housing stock will be lost. So we're also pushing for Congress to provide at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. This too was passed by the House through the HEROES Act and was introduced in the Senate by Senator Sherrod Brown, called the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act. It has 40 co-sponsors in the Senate, 157 in the House. So together, we think those two provisions will do a lot to stem the tide of evictions that are happening in our country. But beyond that, there's a lot of resources that Congress needs to focus on. The third is an additional $11.5 billion, again, as included in the HEROES Act and passed out of the House, to respond to and prevent outbreaks among people experiencing homelessness. We know that people who are homeless who contract coronavirus are twice as likely to be hospitalized, 2 to 4 times as likely to need critical care, and 2 to 3 times more likely to die than the general public who contracts coronavirus. And we're worried that if unchecked, as many as 20,000 people who are homeless could require hospitalization, and nearly 3,500 could die. Of course, that has enormous implications for individuals and their communities, but it also poses a public health risk to our already overstretched hospital systems. We need funds really critically to minimize the number of people who are living in encampments or in shelters, in congregate settings where they're not able to practice social distancing, and we need resources to provide medical respite care, outreach, and other resources for people experiencing homelessness too. And finally, we're pushing for Congress to include at least another $13 billion for public housing agencies, HUD and USDA housing providers, tribal housing authorities, so that we can help keep residents safe and healthy during this crisis. That funding included 100,000 new emergency vouchers targeted to people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. And we think that's a start in the right direction in terms of the longer term resources that might be needed. So I'm sure, like all of you, we're feeling this urgency that every day that Congress waits is putting more people at risk. And we're trying to do as much as we can to put pressure on Congress to take action quickly. Today, Senate Democrats are going to the floor at 4 o'clock to make floor speeches in support of these housing provisions and to put more pressure on their Republican colleagues. We're going to be watching that and tweeting out about it, but you might want to follow along too. And then on July 21st, we're hosting a digital lobby day where we're encouraging advocates across the country to set up meetings with their members of Congress and staff digitally, right, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, but to use that time to really educate them on what inaction means to our communities that we care about. So I want to thank Maria for having me on the call, and I look forward to answering any questions from the audience.
We can't hear you.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry about that. Thank you, Sarah. We appreciate your comments and the information, which is really critical and relevant to us. And I think we'll hold questions until after the speakers have presented, but we'll look forward to those. And now I am very happy to turn it over to Amanda Undieri, who is the CEO of Funders Together to End Homelessness and a leader in so many ways, to talk about impact on homelessness and on people of color and what philanthropy can and should do and whatever else you can share with us. Amanda, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I think my colleague Sarah outlined the case pretty well and the impact that this will have on, we know, people without homes and people who are housing insecure, and particularly the racial disparities. We have seen estimates that say that the crisis of COVID and the pandemic could end up with an additional 250,000 people experiencing homelessness. And we know that millions more will experience the crisis of housing instability and possibly evictions. I think we're having an important conversation within our work to prevent and end homelessness and to think about housing as not only a need but a right, that there is a distinction between eviction prevention and homelessness prevention. And while those distinctions are really important, they're related to the resource allocation that we're seeing in the congressional relief packages, in local funds, and even in the way that philanthropy funds. And we know that we have an important work to do when it comes to thinking about our resource allocation within an equitable way. So a few weeks ago, it seems like months ago, we put out some recommendations for philanthropy to think about how they can support communities and the work nationally around these issues of homelessness and these issues of eviction prevention and the housing crisis. Short and long-term recommendations that are really centered around equity and how we rebuild a system that is more equitable and anti-racist. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our thought process and the way we think philanthropy can work with public funds. And this is not just, I think, recommendations for philanthropy. It's actually recommendations for all of us who are gatekeepers to resources and are thinking about how we benefit, quite frankly, from the hard work of advocates like Sarah that are working with Congress, and how that is distributed locally if we are successful in our congressional advocacy. So I know we've said this before, but I think it's important to reiterate that COVID-19 is not the great equalizer. We know that it's only exacerbated structural inequities. And the disparities we're seeing are rooted in structural racism and are not about race. This is not about a pre-existing condition. It's about pre-existing inequities from stolen Indigenous land and chattel slavery. As Way Forward reminds us, COVID-19 kills, structural racism is its accomplice. As policy advocates and funders, we have to recognize that it's simply not enough to advocate for more resources. We have to be thinking about how do we decolonize and liberate gatekeepers who decide on resource allocation. To be anti-racist, we have to do an impact analysis of what got us here and work to change those structures, not just add more money to the problem and contribute to what I call the layer cake of racism, where we put seemingly good policies and resources on top of structures that were designed to oppress Black and Indigenous people. We know, though, it's crucial that the resources that are advocated for and allocated go to the most vulnerable and historically marginalized communities first, like Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, LGBTQ people, and youth that are often overlooked and left out of response efforts. In order for response and recovery efforts to be equitable, these questions shared by the Consumer Health Foundation should be asked at each step of any design and implementation process, including philanthropic responses. How does your response, even in the midst of crisis, contribute to long-term systems change? How are the voices of impacted communities centered? What data, quantitative or qualitative, are driving resource allocation? And what does that data tell you about the experience of various racial and ethnic groups? How are women and LGBTQIA people of color particularly impacted? What are possible unintended consequences of the decisions you might make? What additional disaggregated demographic data will you collect, track, and evaluate to assess equity impacts in your COVID-19 response moving forward, and especially as we receive more resources from congressional relief packages? How will that data inform your future decisions when the crisis is over? Although I don't think we believe this crisis will be over. We are in a seated pretty permanently in two crises that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And this is especially important for me as we turn a page on trying to do anti-racist work. How are the actions you're taking grounded in the racialized history of this country? Like I said, we developed a set of recommendations for funders, but we hope will help ground communities. We worked really closely with our national partners like the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the Center on Budget around their framework to align our recommendations. So here are some things, thoughtful things that we think philanthropy and other gatekeepers who have access to power and resources should be thinking about as we think about not only eviction prevention, but housing stability. How are you working with local and state officials to ensure that federal dollars coming in support homelessness and housing programs, initiatives, and organizations that prioritize racial equity and use disaggregated data to determine how resources and funding should be distributed equitably? This will also mean supporting real-time evaluation so communities can pivot, course correct, especially if funding interventions are not meeting the needs of disaggregated data populations. I think it's really important to point out, especially around eviction prevention, that we know a lot of Black and Indigenous communities and people of color have informal rental relationships. Those are often not documented in the numbers that we are seeing. And we know that the communities that are first responders, so to speak, in working with people of color and Black and Indigenous folks are often not a part of mainstream systems. And so are we thinking about who will get those resources and how will we get those resources first, especially for those who don't have access to mainstream systems? So it's really important to champion and fund grassroots organizations led by people of color to work with federal, state, and local leaders to advance equitable implementation of relief package funds, and especially any eviction prevention fund efforts. It's important that we think, especially as philanthropy, about funding grassroots organizations to hold local leaders accountable to policies enacted by congressional relief packages. and look at where rapid response dollars are going and ensure that organizations led by and serving people of color and LGBTQ people are receiving resources every time that resources are distributed. And we need to start to examine how culturally specific organizations are or are not connected to mainstream organizations and policy tables, as I said before. Local and national philanthropy should be thinking about resourcing both mainstream organizations to work with culturally specific organizations and vice versa. We know historically these organizations or communities, or sometimes just the aunt at the end of the block, are not at the table in collaborative ways to think about how we reach communities of color. So it's important we create space to learn about authentic collaboration in policy and funding decisions, engaging people with lived expertise, and making sure that people with lived expertise have real power at decision-making tables. We often have these decision-making tables and bring people with lived expertise with a folding chair, not with a permanent chair. And I think it's really important for funders, if there are funders on this call, to think about the work that advocates are doing locally and nationally. And this is the time to really fund public and political will building capacity and mechanisms that will drive local and state governments to create and support long-term solutions to ensure that there are real prevention plans and real rehousing plans, and that resources don't compete with one another. We should not have to make the decision about which resources go to eviction prevention versus homelessness prevention versus housing stabilization. You know, that's really succumbing to white supremacy culture, where we either or think or have this scarcity resource mindset, and we build this competition among grantee partners or community partners. And we need to start thinking about funding the strategic communication and messaging campaigns to reinforce the importance of home, not just during a time of crisis, but as a human need and right. We saw extraordinary and unprecedented political will surrounding housing, immediate housing needs, some of these eviction moratoriums. How can we push on that political will and public will now that people understand the importance of home? And part of that decision-making process often has to be, or always has to be done through an equity-based lens with mid-course corrections, as I talked about before. And I think philanthropy and other leaders who are gatekeepers of resources need to model the process of acknowledging that the existing systems are broken and structurally racist, and push community stakeholders to prioritize rebuilding new, resilient, anti-racist systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for all of that important analysis and really call to action for all of us. Really appreciate that. Appreciate your leadership. We'll move to John, and we'll hear about the movement for civil right to counsel. We know that access to counsel can make the difference between staying in one's home and homelessness, and yet the vast majority of tenants do not have access to counsel in contrast to landlords. So John has been a leader in the right to counsel movement, which is gaining traction, and we're excited to hear your presentation, John. So please go ahead.
Thank you. And Maria, you can see my slides okay?
I can.
Great, fantastic. So I'm really pleased to be here today, and especially to go after two such thorough presentations that made really covered the landscape of why this is such a critical moment from a homelessness perspective, from a race equity perspective. I'm going to try to not repeat the excellent points that were already made. I wanted to just lay out really quickly when we look at a right to counsel in eviction cases, what we look at, like what the principal arguments are, and some of which has already been discussed by the excellent presentations, but when you look at what's at stake when someone loses their shelter, the cascade of consequences that happens, especially when homelessness is the direct result, the effects on employment, on child custody, which is something that often is not looked at as much, physical liberty in the case of people who are arrested for being homeless, the effect on health, especially during COVID-19, as was pointed out, on children's education. The list of consequences goes on and on. In fact, housing basically implicates practically every other basic human need in which we work. So it's one of the reasons why it's such a focal point for the work that we do. Also, the difference that full representation makes, we have such a robust body of data showing that, in fact, when people have counsel, full representation, that it makes a tremendous outcome difference in the outcomes on people's cases. They stay in their homes more, they avoid disruptive displacement, and especially they avoid homelessness. The massive asymmetry of representation is also extremely important. 90% of tenants typically go without counsel, whereas only about 10% of landlords do. And that disparate representation has a real impact on the lack of fundamental fairness in housing court. There are tremendous financial benefits of providing counsel. All of the negative consequences I just outlined, unemployment, custody, liberty, health, education, many of those have direct, tangible consequences for jurisdictions. They have to pay for homeless shelters. They have to pay for prisons. They have to pay for law enforcement. They have to pay for emergency care at hospitals. All of those costs, or so many of those costs, could be avoided if tenants had counsel at the outset. The disproportionate impact on communities of color was well discussed, and I'm going to give you some numbers that we've seen that really make the case, especially right now during COVID-19, which itself has a disproportionate impact, why this issue cannot be ignored, and the disproportionate impact on communities of color, especially Black tenants, and I should say especially Black female tenants who see the bulk of that impact. And the absence of counsel, the way that we have an indigent defense system, a criminal justice system that's already overtaxed, and some of the people who are evicted wind up in the criminal justice system as a result of being homeless, and that's something we cannot afford to see happen. These are some statistics from the Eviction Lab showing that in 17 of 36 states that were examined, that Black female renters were filed out for eviction at double the rate for white renters. That is a staggering statistic. Some of the specific statistics from some of the cities that we've looked at, in Baltimore, Black female tenants are 4 times more likely to be evicted than white men. In Chicago, Black tenants face eviction or filed that for eviction 3 times the rate of white tenants and twice the citywide average, particularly in the areas where there was the highest concentration of Black tenants. These are really troubling, very serious statistics that were before COVID-19. This is not a problem that COVID-19 created. So what was happening before COVID-19 with the picture like this? What was happening prior to COVID-19 to try to move this forward? Well, actually, right before COVID-19, as Maria was saying, there was a really dominant right to counsel movement that had gained steam over the last 4 to 5 years. And I love this article from Next City when it said, "Is tenants' right to counsel on its way to becoming standard practice?" This was issued in December, and we really were on that way. In just 5 years, we had 5 cities, including the city with the most evictions in the country, New York City, that enacted a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. Each one of these works differently in terms of what tenants they cover, but basically low-income tenants, except for San Francisco, where there was no income limit. But 5 cities in just 5 years, including some that have, like New York City, having staggering eviction numbers. Evictions in New York there are more than 200,000 eviction filings per year in New York City. So having New York City go first was really transformative in terms of defining the movement. Before COVID, again, in addition to the cities that enacted right to counsel, all of these places, some states, some cities, had significant right to counsel initiatives and legislation pending before COVID-19 that were really moving forward. Really exciting state legislation in Massachusetts and Connecticut, but also some great initiatives in some of these other places. And then in addition to the places that had either passed legislation or had legislation that was on the table, all of these jurisdictions were working on right to counsel in one way or another. And I just point you towards the incredible spread geographically of these places. Yes, you have California, and yes, you have Chicago, but you also have Oklahoma City and Kansas City and Toledo and Detroit and Columbus. Just the enthusiasm, the momentum, the incredible energy around right to counsel was really something we had never seen before from this, and really transforming it into a national movement. And lastly, there was also incredible energy and interest at the federal level. There were 4 bills filed and a 5th one that was in the works before COVID hit that would have provided money to cities and states that enacted a right to counsel. And we're still hoping to see some of these move forward, but just showing that the interest was at the local level, at the city level, at the state level, and at the federal level. And one thing that also really struck a lot of us who've been working on this issue for a while was the way that the presidential candidates were talking about right to counsel. Really, housing itself and evictions were never, as far as I can remember, part of a presidential debate or presidential platforms. And this year, pretty much all the major candidates released housing platforms, and a number of them actually specifically endorsed a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. So that really, that just showed how far the movement had come. It also is extremely important to note that the right to counsel that was achieved in New York City, the one that was achieved in San Francisco, and in some of the other cities would not have happened without organizing, without tenant organizers. They really drove the train on making right to counsel happen. Historically, this has been a movement led by lawyers, especially white lawyers. The face of this movement has really been changing, and we're seeing the sort of tenant-centered, a lot of the effort to make right to counsel tenant-centered, to make the movement driven by tenants. And that's something that is really transformative to the way that the movement looks, and in terms of the empowerment that a right to counsel can actually bring to tenants. What we've seen in terms of the success for right to counsel, the data is early yet, because only 2 cities, New York and San Francisco, have actually gotten far enough in their implementation to provide data. But in New York City, where they're in the 3rd year of implementation, 84% of the tenants who are represented are remaining in their homes. 84%, which is incredible. The citywide representation rate has risen from 1%, that's how many tenants were represented before the right to counsel started, to 38%. It's a 5-year implementation program. Evictions have dropped 41%, including 15% last year. The eviction filings have dropped 30%, which is an indication that a lot of those filings were likely frivolous. The kinds of things that are filed by landlords who know that tenants don't have counsel and can basically file anything. Default judgments, which is tenants not appearing for court, have dropped 34%. I mean, these are just unbelievable numbers, even better than we had hoped, I think, and in line with historically what the studies have shown that have looked at the effect of providing counsel. What's also transformative is that the judges in New York basically have testified that, contrary to the fear that providing counsel as a matter of right would, from their perspective, slow down their courts too much, they've actually said it has not had a negative impact on them, and they've testified how it's allowed them to make the proceedings more fair, and they've actually been very supportive of the right to counsel. San Francisco has actually seen similar success. Their filing rate has gone down 10%, and 67% of the tenants who are represented with full scope representation are remaining in their homes. So it just really, the proof is really coming in that right to counsel does exactly what it's always been said it was done when the studies were done of smaller pilot programs. There's also been a wealth of data showing that providing counsel saves money, which at this time and during COVID is obviously a critical message. Even before New York provided a right to counsel, there was a study showing that the city would save $320 million a year if a right to counsel existed. Philly showed that in a recent report right before their right to counsel was enacted, that a $3.5 million investment would yield $45 million in savings from things like homeless shelter use, avoided homeless shelter use, avoided healthcare costs, and so on. And a report from Baltimore that just came out found that a $5.7 million investment would yield $35.6 million in savings. So there's real data to support, especially right now when cities and states are scrambling to figure out how they're going to pay for things, to show that a lot of the costs that are increasing as a result of COVID could be made more stable if a right to counsel was provided. So where does that leave us? That was before COVID. So what is happening since COVID? One thing that's happening is that despite the protections that have been enacted at the federal level and the city level and the state level, like the moratoria, a lot of landlords are actually ignoring them. They're filing evictions in violation of the moratoria, which is illegal, and which without counsel often is going to succeed because the tenants don't know and the courts are not acting as gatekeepers to stop these illegal moratoria. In some places, they're not even bothering with the filing an eviction because they know there's a moratoria, so they're just trying to force the tenants out through shutting off their utilities or threatening them. And in Nevada, where they're locking out tenants, we recently got a report that 900, they've got the legal services program there has seen 900 illegal lockouts this year compared to, I think, 12 or 13 in all of 2019. So we're really seeing the need for counsel, despite these other protections, which are absolutely critical, is not diminished just because there's a moratoria in place. The legal complexities of the moratoria itself really raised the need for counsel. The CARES Act, which provides a federal level moratoria for some tenants, is extremely complicated. It's in terms of knowing whether a property is covered by the CARES Act, it's a very complicated determination for a lot of the tenants. Some of the states have required landlords to, when they file an eviction, to say whether or not their property is a covered property or not, but most don't. So that alone requires the presence of counsel. There's also a mess of federal, state, and local moratoria that are layered on top of each other, that are constantly changing. Some of them are expiring, some of them are being renewed, some of them are being altered, some of them are issued by the governor, some are issued by the court, some of them by both. Expecting that tenants are going to be able to keep up with this and know what protections they have without counsel is very low. And the moratoria themselves, even in one particular moratoria, can be very complex, because some of them say a landlord can't file for eviction. Some of them say a landlord can file for eviction, but the court can't hear it. Some of them say that the court can issue an eviction, but a sheriff can't carry it out. And again, expecting the tenants to know all of that is not likely. And then some of the moratoria require the tenant to prove that they have a loss related to COVID-19, which can be a difficult thing to prove. And then after the eviction moratoria expire, we're expecting, as you heard before, an avalanche of evictions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what work's being done to try to predict what that avalanche is going to look like. But with the unemployment rolls at 3 times the national norms, we're expecting a lot of tenants, especially as the CARES Act stimulus payments, the effect of those, which were given in April, runs out. We're expecting to really see an increase very soon. What really hurts about the lack of a right to counsel is the fact that when you don't have a right to counsel, there's no requirement that the government fund it. So when other sources of funding start to disappear, which is what's happening right now, IOLTA is one of the primary funding sources for legal services. And because the Fed has cut the interest rate to 0, IOLTA, which relies on the interest rates, basically has seen their revenue drop through the floor. And in addition to IOLTA revenue, a lot of legal services programs rely on court filing fees, and those filing fees are way down also because the courts are largely closed. So without a right to counsel, as those funds dry up, the governments, city, state, and federal, don't have any obligation to put any new funding in because there's no right. And that's another reason why we advocate so strongly for this to be a right. So what we are doing right now during COVID-19, I should first say the first thing we really emphasize constantly is that right to counsel is not a piece that stands alone. There needs to be a nationwide moratorium, and not just of some properties, and not one that ends at the end of this month. There needs to be rent cancellation or substantial rent assistance directed to tenants, and there needs to be a right to counsel. All 3 of those pieces are necessary. And I so love the remarks about not making this an either or, because that's so essential that we do not think of these things as it has to be one of these things. We need to advocate passionately for all of them, especially at a time when the federal government has spent trillions of dollars in partially for business bailouts. The money is there, it's just the political will has to be there. We are fortunately seeing the right to counsel as part of the package of reforms. There have been some great policy documents put out by tenant advocates across the country that are looking for really broad relief and right to counsel as included as part of the permanent tenant protection. So continuing to advocate for that, highlighting the due process concerns for what the courts are doing right now. Basically, as the courts have started to reopen, they're conducting a combination of, some are doing remote hearings and some are doing in-person hearings. The remote hearings are really rife with due process problems. A lot of tenants don't have internet access, they don't have broadband access, they don't have the right technology. They do have the right technology, but they don't know how to use it for the court process. There are technical difficulties. They don't have access to an interpreter. They don't know when they're supposed to show up or where. They get dropped during the call. The people with disabilities can't participate in this kind of process effectively. So there are tons of problems. We're basically working with advocates to gather those problems together, to document them, all of which highlights both the need to freeze the eviction cases, to turn them back off and put the moratoria back in place, but also for the need for counsel and why it's so critical that people have counsel to protect due process. The in-person proceedings also have huge due process problems because it's unclear, and substantive due process because it's unclear how people with health issues are going to participate in these high volume proceedings without endangering their health. And in fact, we've heard in some cases that some courts are defaulting tenants who show up without a mask, even though the tenants may not know about that requirement, not have a mask, not have access to a mask, and so on and so forth. Mediation has been proposed by some of the courts, mandatory mediation as a way to try to solve this problem, but we're not very optimistic that mediation that's initiated after a landlord files for eviction that is done without counsel for the tenant will have much effect in this based on the data that we've seen in the past. And illegal evictions, again, responding to the illegal evictions, the non-compliance with the CARES Act, trying to, again, highlight all of the continuing need for counsel, even with the moratoria that are in place. There's also, we're trying to support the moratoria. That there have been 9 lawsuits now filed by landlords in different jurisdictions to stop the state and city moratoria. So we're basically doing the work to support those. We consider that essential to the right to counsel work because we cannot afford to have the moratoria ended right now. The right to counsel burden is significant right now. We need the moratoria to stay in place as long as possible. We are also tracking the jurisdictions that are requiring the CARES Act affidavits, encouraging other jurisdictions that don't have one to say, you need to require landlords to certify whether their property is covered by the act or not. That also gives counsel more ammunition to work with where that affidavit exists. Supporting research on how tenant advocates can actually bring lawsuits to stop the eviction proceedings based on the due process problems I've just referred to before. We've done some pretty extensive research along with the National Housing Law Project and others on the due process issues, and really extensive research on the moratoria and how to uphold those legally, and trying to predict the number of incoming evictions that are going to happen and the amount of rent shortages. There have been a few of those were mentioned earlier in this presentation for New York and elsewhere that have been done. We're actually working on a 50-state eviction tracker, eviction prediction tracker that we're hoping to release in the next week or two that will help advocates know what might be coming based on census data about what tenants are saying about whether they paid rent or not, along with historical figures about evictions. And lastly, we're doing work to advocate for the use of CARES Act money for legal representation. It's really difficult to find information about which jurisdictions have spent money on legal representation under the CARES Act, but we now know that about a dozen jurisdictions have spent CDBG or coronavirus relief funds money on legal representation for tenants. And there was some additional LSC money in the original CARES Act that was appropriated, but especially the CDBG and coronavirus relief fund, advocating for use of those for representation in addition to direct rental assistance and the other uses to which it's being put. I'll lastly mention this. I mentioned the Baltimore report. This report came out actually during COVID just to show that the advocacy is still going even as COVID continues. This report came out which has the cost savings numbers I mentioned, and it was immediately followed by the Baltimore Sun editorializing saying this should be done, providing a right to counsel can pay for itself. This is something the city should be doing. It's notable that in the Baltimore report also noticed that 80% of the renters in Baltimore would be able to raise a defense if they had counsel, but only 8% actually do so. Like, in other words, 80% actually have a defense to the eviction, potential defense to the eviction, but only 8% know how to raise it. And the representation statistics in Baltimore, as you can see, 96% of the landlords have counsel and only 1% of the tenants. So it's the same disparity we've been talking about everywhere. If you want to see this information, we have it at civilrightstocounsel.org. We track a lot of this information on our website, especially the right to counsel bills and the efforts. And the National Housing Law Project also has an incredible page on all of the moratoria and all the protections and the due process concerns. They have just a wonderful COVID-19 page that I encourage you to check out. And the Eviction Lab has a report card on all of the moratoria and what they cover in each state and what they don't cover, which is a really useful tool if you're trying to see what your state does and how it compares to others. That's my contact information if you would like to reach out to me. And again, this is a seminal moment for our movement. It's a seminal movement for housing. It's a seminal movement to recognize finally the right to housing itself, which is what the right to counsel is intended to protect, and to recognize that at this moment, we cannot afford to ignore the gross disparate impact that this has on Black tenants especially, and on communities of color in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. We now have time for questions. As a reminder, this is a 90-minute webinar, and so we are on until 12:30. You still have plenty of time to enter in your questions. You'll see the questions tab on the box that's appearing on the right-hand side of your screen. We have received a number of great questions. I am going to throw a couple of basic ones out really to the entire panel just to give us a little more context for this part of the conversation. Can the panelists talk a little bit about what rent cancellation is and how that compares with eviction moratorium and moratoria, and why that's important to include as a piece?
I'm happy to say start off. If so, one of the things is that rent cancellation is an umbrella term that means a lot of different things to different places, but in its most pure form, it would basically mean that the rent that was owed during the pandemic is no longer owed. It would simply make that obligation disappear. That some of the variations on rent cancellation would not go necessarily that far. They would say that the rent is still owed, but that it can't be used as the basis for an eviction. That if the landlord wants to collect that money, they have to use a different process, like the normal civil debt collection process. Some of the other efforts have been more modest than that as well. Some of them have just said that, the payment, that the rent has to be, that the tenant has to be given some number of months, an essentially extended period of time to pay back the rent. That's not really rent cancellation again, but it falls under the umbrella of rent cancellation. And the moratoria basically just say evictions are halted, across the board, generally speaking. The rent cancellation may or may not halt evictions, or basically it just changes the nature of the nature of the debt that's owed between the tenant and the landlord.
Great. Is there anything that the audience members should know about how rent cancellation might affect mom and pop landlords who rely on rental income, and what concurrent efforts are being made to care for that population as well?
I can jump in. So I think that that's one of the struggles where the downstream effects of rent cancellation, depending on how it's structured, I know a lot of people are talking about lots of different ways of doing it. But one of the important things is making sure that property owners also receive the rental income that they need to pay their staff and to upkeep properties, because we know that in the long run that could lead to more distressed units or more distressed properties that are ultimately sold to more corporate landlords over the long run. We saw that after the 2008 financial crisis, where a lot of investors bought up properties, and that's not good in the long run either. And so some sort of financial assistance needs to be provided to small landlords and other landlords so that they can keep up with their debt service and their property management. But from our perspective, the best way to provide that assistance is to go through the tenant up towards the landlord rather from the landlord down, because it's easier to keep people in their homes. It's easier to ensure that renters are being protected if it's assistance that's being provided directly to tenants first. And I was actually just on a phone call yesterday with resident organizers who were talking about this very issue and how they were seeing, even in their communities, where some rental assistance might have been provided to landlords, but that landlords were still moving forward with evictions and still holding tenants accountable for back rent, even though they were getting financial assistance from their city and state. And so having that's sort of the dynamic that comes into play, at least at the federal level, where we're seeing property owners, landlord associations in alignment with many advocacy organizations in pushing for rental assistance, because rental assistance has that upstream positive impact for property owners too.
That's a great point. There's a lot of good reason. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. So Representative Omar's bill, which was a very comprehensive rent cancellation bill, had a provision in it about a fund created for landlords, that they could, and actually also banks, I believe too, because the stream continues to go upward. If the landlords don't get paid, then the banks will, then you start having issues with mortgage payments, and there, forgiveness for low-income homeowners is an issue as well. I would say too that we strongly believe that rent cancellation is constitutional. In fact, we did extensive research to support that in the places where it's being pursued. But relief provided to landlords certainly helps with the constitutional analysis. It mitigates the sort of takings clause concerns that they will raise. It is strategically, I think it's also important, as well as, and legally and strategically it's important, in addition to the pragmatically for landlords who may genuinely also be, caught in the pinch.
And I'll also just say politically, there's a benefit to folks pushing for rent cancellation in their communities. It's really moved members of Congress to be more active on emergency rental assistance proposals than they might have been otherwise. And so I see it as, it takes all types pushing in the same direction to get to where we're going. And I think it's been really helpful to have folks, especially in California and New York, pushing on Schumer and Pelosi to do more in this housing space, because we've seen them be more active on housing during this pandemic than I've seen them in my 10 years on the Hill. So that's largely because, one, the crisis was so bad, but also because grassroots organizing is putting a lot of pressure on them to take more action.
Thank you. I'll just add that the rent cancellation efforts seem to be the ones that would have the highest level of effectiveness of keeping people in housing, which has a positive benefit to communities at large in terms of revenue expenditures. And so I wonder if we can talk about the cost savings analysis, if there has been any cost savings analysis. I know there has been around a right to counsel, so I'd love to hear more about that from you, John. But whether part of the argument in favor of rent cancellation is that, especially as governments struggle with dwindling revenues during this period, that these are in fact long-term cost-saving measures.
That's a good question. The only cost-saving measures I've seen has been on the homeless prevention side versus the cost of homelessness, when you're meeting people after they're already experiencing homelessness. I've seen studies that show as much as like a 3-to-1 cost savings on that. For the rent cancellation piece, I'd have to think a little bit more about what those long-term cost savings would be. And I think, yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if maybe John or Amanda have more on that. I'd be interested in knowing.
I think that, I haven't seen numbers on rent cancellation in specific, I think in part because it was never contemplated until just now and no one's had time to really do anything like that. But I think Sarah's right that the homelessness prevention numbers, which we use, for instance, for right to counsel, would be just as true for rent, whether the relief is right to counsel or rent relief. It's the same sort of analysis. So I think it would be just as true. I also just really have to say Amanda's presentation was so amazing to listen to, and just the part about like not being, this is the time to be bold. Like, this is not the time to be compromising on what we're seeking. Like, rent cancellation is bold, and in prior to this year, it would never have been like. I think we have the chance now to push for that and say this is what needs to happen. This is and a moratorium and right to counsel, again, like all of those things. And we've seen, I think in New York, passed a rent cancellation proposal. It can be done. It's not. It's something that we, as long as we're saying we're not going to accept going back to the status quo, I think we can accomplish it.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I think, Sarah, what you sparked for me is that is a great role that philanthropy can play, either nationally or locally, to do that analysis with groups about what are the cost savings, because it's a great advocacy tool, I think, and just important to know. And I appreciate both of you mentioning the importance of organizing and like lifting up these policies. I think for many of us, we know that actually organizers, people on the ground, have been pushing bold policies for a long time. They never got traction. And to be completely candid, I feel like we are at a moment in our country, especially for those of us who've been talking about racial justice for a long time and people are paying attention in a different way, that we're seeing some of the boldest policy recommendations being considered at the local and national level. And what a time for us to push those bold policy recommendations, to not take no for an answer, to push philanthropy and other funders to recognize the importance of organizing and policy that is not safe and really starts to get at some of the racial justice issues. The fact that we are considering what does it mean to divest from the criminal legal system and invest in things that actually make communities safe. There's no reason to think that we can't think about rent cancellation, right? Like it seems to me, I've not had a lot of hope actually for the past few weeks. You know, it's quite frankly been really hard to be a Black woman in America for a long time, but particularly as the rest of the country like realizes what racial injustice actually is. But when I think about bold policies that are being talked about in ways that seem real, that's when I have hope. And I think it's really important for the folks listening to realize that that's the intersection of hope and boldness is actually where we make change, right? And we're just at a moment right now where we can't let go. We can't take our foot off the gas. And I think all of us, though, need to take stock for, like, even though these bold policies are pushing through, that we still have a lot of ways in which we think about policy in very white dominant terms and white dominant frames, and how are we even preventing some of these bold policies? I was on a call earlier today and someone said if it makes you a little cringy in your belly, then actually those are the right things that organizers have been pushing for. And sometimes some of us who are funders, who are advocates, might feel a little cringy in our belly because these policies are too bold. And that's actually when we need to keep pushing forward, even though it makes us feel uncomfortable.
Thank you. Amanda, following up on what you just said, there were a number of questions from audience members asking whether the questions that you laid out to ensure that bold policies are being pursued, are those written out in a resource that people can use as they're discussing policy changes? And if so, where can they find it?
Absolutely. So I did, they are in our recommendations for philanthropy. And everything I talked about is actually fully laid out in our recommendations. I did send that link to some of the organizers, but if you go to funderstogether.org, our philanthropy recommendations are up there, and we have links to other racial equity resources. And if anyone ever needs me to talk them through like the particular roles of philanthropy, happy to do that as well.
Great. We do have requests for all of your contact information. So if you are willing to share it with the audience, if you can put that into, I think it would be the chat box, as long as that can get shared with everyone. And even if it can't, we'll make sure that's included in the follow-up email. Really appreciate that. We've had some questions also about rural communities. You know, we've talked about some of the data surrounding some of the large urban areas and some of the statewide data. Has there been any efforts made to protect renters or low-income homeowners during this period who are living in rural areas?
I can speak to the resources side because I think this shows some of the underlying dynamics that are going on in Congress, which is that the CARES Act passed. There was lots of $12 billion in housing resources that were included, and we were really glad to see that initial investment. But none of those dollars were for rural housing or rural residents, even though it's interesting because that's the segment of the population that's most likely to be represented by Republicans. Democrats have tended to care more about housing, and we saw a gap happen where rural renters and their needs fell through the cracks too. They are proposing to correct that in the HEROES Act, but I think it was pretty embarrassing that that bill was passed without a real obvious constituent included.
We've also had a question about undocumented people and whether any of the relief that is available now is available to them. Anything you can say about that?
Yeah, so it's a little complicated, and I can share a chart with folks that outlines all of the different housing resources and their eligibility based on immigration status. But on the whole, there are a couple different major sources of funding that can be used for undocumented people, including HUD's ESG program, the Emergency Solutions Grants Program, CDBG, Community Development Block Grants, and the $150 billion Coronavirus Relief Fund that was included in the CARES Act. So there are pots of money that can be used to serve undocumented people. I will say that I'm increasingly worried that Republicans have figured out that those funds can be used for undocumented people, and we're seeing more of a concerted effort, especially among House Republicans, to prevent that from happening in the next CARES Act. So, the next coronavirus package. Just earlier this week on Monday, the House voted on just the housing emergency provisions of the HEROES Act. It was taken out, and there was a separate vote just on that. And Republicans sought to basically stop the bill from moving forward and require that provisions be added that would bar any undocumented person from accessing any sort of assistance whatsoever. And I think the fear that all of us have had that Republicans would catch on is starting to happen. And so there's a lot of work that all of us have to do to make sure that the next coronavirus package allows for undocumented people to be able to access those funds. And I think that's going to be a tough battle in the coming weeks. I'll also say that just because undocumented people are eligible for that assistance doesn't mean that state and local governments will use it that way. And so it's really important that advocates are weighing in with their city and state government officials now as they're planning on how to use those funds, so they can use it in a way that's not just allowable for undocumented people, but is targeting them for assistance, because they're often ineligible for other forms of federal assistance like the stimulus checks or unemployment insurance. And so they're often going to be left behind and in greatest need of assistance going forward.
And just to add to that as well, they may be afraid of applying, which is a whole other layer to this. In fact, one of the advantages of the moratoria is that they apply to everyone. It doesn't matter who you are. But what we've heard is that some landlords are threatening to call ICE if their tenants don't basically leave voluntarily. Like, in other words, the landlords know they can't evict them, so they're just threatening them. And that's these kinds of fears, especially in the current climate, are very real, and they can impede, the best protections, whether it's rental assistance or a moratoria, from being effective.
I think this is really an important point about why we need to think outside of specific housing organizations to be a part of our housing ecosystem, because the trust issue is there with folks who are undocumented and folks who just, for a lot of reasons, historical and otherwise, don't access mainstream systems. And when we think about how we're resourcing the capacity to reach folks, whether it's through public or private dollars, we really have to be thinking about, so who do folks who are undocumented or folks who are marginalized, who do they trust? And how are those organizations, those community organizers, those mutual benefit aid societies, whatever they are, like, again, could be the aunt that just holds space for people in need in the community. How are we thinking about how to integrate our mainstream systems into these systems who historically have not been a part of the system and continually marginalized? Because without that, all the resources in the world are not going to build trust, right? And I think we all know that. And I just want to put a fine point on that, because that's a real concern for a lot of folks in communities. We could have these resources and it might not reach the people who need it, because we don't have that trust building.
We certainly see in the homelessness advocacy space, we see that dynamic play out all the time, and it certainly is going to be true. You mentioned in your presentation, Amanda, the need to create space so that people with lived experience are able to not have the folding chair, but a permanent chair at the table to inform the policies that affect them as one of the things that happens. Can you talk a little bit about how to create space as the paradigm shifts? How can we approach this work in a different way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I'm thinking about even the things that I always say, like, I think the first step one is to create space. I think step two, if you're really thinking about it, is to giving up power so people who are historically marginalized can create the space that they need in their own to inform policy decisions and resources priorities. But I think it starts with what I said is the authentic collaboration. A lot of times, people with lived expertise are thought of afterwards. They're not a part of the policy making process or the resource allocation process. We don't often consider the racialized history of our country through the lens of people with lived expertise, and we wait till like there's a crisis and it's like, oh, we should check with folks, rather than creating environments where those folks are part of our natural community. Like, they're at the table all the time. We don't have to scramble to figure out how this is going to impact them. And I don't have like a checklist of how to do that, right? What I can say is that it takes undoing our power structures. It takes resourcing and realizing where we have our own bias, where we have our own, whether it's adultism or our own prejudices that don't allow for that authentic collaboration. And it's a lot of work. I think people are also waking up to the fact that like undoing white supremacy culture is painful. It was painful for me as a Black woman, right? Like, I'm swimming in that water too. And so it has to take a concerted effort. It can't be just like a committee at the side. It has to be centered as your work as an organization in your community. And it takes asking people like about how they feel like they have power. I think a lot of times I see people with lived expertise in communities at the table, but they still don't feel like they have power. And so I think that's really important to do that constant analysis of their own power and ability to influence.
And if I can just add something to that, one of the things that I think our legal communities really learned from working with organizers is that there's a difference between a right to counsel that's delivered to communities and ones that they are empowered to achieve themselves. It's different. There's a difference between being involved in the change and having the change happen. And I think we've been working really to try to figure out how to recenter the work that we do around around affected communities, and have it be that, because I think really it is the right to counsel, especially for the work that we do, can become such a change in the power relationship between the landlord and the tenant, but it's more so if the tenants have been part of that victory in getting it, and not simply just it's sort of brought to them after it's already done. I think we've really seen that in New York, and we've seen it. And I'll just give an example. The right to counsel in New York City, some of the tenants are rent striking right now in New York, and that's something which the right to counsel made possible. But the boldness of deciding to do that was driven by the same people who achieved the right in the first place and how to use it. I don't know that the lawyers achieving right to counsel necessarily would have gone that path. That's not the legal services, has not been the path, the mindset. So we've really been learning and seeing how the power dynamic and how that's really changed through community investment in the process and involvement and leadership in the process.
Can you give us a little bit about what rent striking is?
Oh, sure. Basically just tenants saying, we're not, the rent is due, we're not going to pay. It's like, there's not been rent cancellation, so they're just saying we're going on strike, we're not going to pay our rent, especially, tenants who are in, large buildings where landlords have the resources to weather the storm, the tenants don't. So I think that, and the right to counsel can help protect those tenants in engaging something like a rent strike potentially.
That leads to another question we had about efforts, if there are any, to prevent landlords from reporting back rent to credit bureaus. We know that your credit score, what's on your credit report, can be an immediate barrier to housing access for years. And so this is a legacy that can produce homelessness over time, flowing from the event that we're experiencing today. Are there any efforts, either in federal legislation or local legislation, to address that piece?
Yeah, this is Sarah. I think there's language already in the HEROES Act that would prevent property owners from reporting negatively to credit reports based on rent income. But John, maybe do you know the details of that more than I do?
You know, we haven't tracked that piece. Where we deal with the credit reporting is really in the eviction process and trying to ensure that evictions themselves are not reported, because that has damage on the credit. But as far as the back rent not being reported, I haven't been following that piece of it.
We also have some questions about model policies. Is there any example of a eviction moratorium that you would hold up as one that has all of the components, or is kind of the best model that we've got nationwide to point people to?
I mean, that fortunately, the eviction scorecard that the Eviction Lab developed was exactly for that purpose. They basically rate all the moratoria in extensive detail, and they go through which elements they have and don't have. I think Massachusetts, actually the list is shuffled a little bit as the states have tinkered with their moratoria, but I think Massachusetts is at the top, or was at one point. But there definitely is a wealth of information there about what a good moratoria looks like. There also have been some model moratoria documents that have been put out by different organizations. I think that the National Housing Law Project has one on their website, I believe. And so there are other places to look as well as in addition to what's in practice. But the scorecard, the nice thing about it is it says what they have, and it also says what they don't have. Even the best state doesn't have everything. And so they indicate what they don't have but should.
Is there a push among those advocating for eviction moratoria to include non-traditional forms of housing, like tents located in public space, vehicle homes, or other types of non-traditional housing?
That's a good question. I think from what I remember of the HEROES Act, I'll start with the CARES Act, as John mentioned, only covers about 30% of renters. So it only covered renters in federally assisted or subsidized or insured housing. The HEROES Act expands that to nearly all renters. I think the definition that they use is any dwelling under the Fair Housing Act, but I don't know if that's inclusive of the types of housing that you're talking about or not. We need a better attorney than me on the line.
Well, I will share that go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was only going to say that I have been hearing about hotels in particular, like people who are staying in long-term hotels. There's been a lot of work around trying to protect them and whether or not their housing constitutes a dwelling and so on and so forth. I don't really know the outcome of that. I just know that there have been people working on it, like trying to ensure that they're brought into the coverage.
I'll share just for the audience, Washington State has recently expanded its eviction moratorium. It does include people living in encampments, but only authorized encampments, which represents a very tiny fraction of encampments in Washington State. But it is an example of how the eviction moratorium lobbying effort can benefit people who are living outside right now. So switching gears a little bit, we had some questions about data. Data collection is huge. And Amanda, you talked about disaggregated data. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and what we should be collecting and reviewing and why?
Sure. So, a lot of times we collect data that simply talks about like the number of people who could be evicted, or people that we know are facing a housing crisis, people experiencing homelessness. Disaggregated data is simply disaggregating that data by race or other marginalized populations. So we should be able to know how many Black LGBTQ youth are experiencing homelessness in your community, or how many Indigenous older Americans are facing eviction crisis. I'm giving examples that I know mean like tons of work leading up to a crisis to be able to do that. But we've been working within our systems to disaggregate data for a while, and we should at least have some high level analysis of being able to disaggregate by race, by age, and combining that. So again, so what marginalized populations through an intersectional lens are facing a crisis. I think always the question is like, what do we do with disaggregated data? And it should inform policy. But I also want to note to our questions about trust before, that there are a lot of communities who don't show up in the data. Historically, we know Indigenous and Latinx communities don't show up in data. So that's really important to engage people with lived expertise, because they often fill in the gaps where data doesn't explain why we might be seeing something out in the field that looks different than the data. And so we need to be thinking about that constantly.
Just on the data front as well, speaking of not showing up, half of the tenants in most jurisdictions don't show up for eviction court for very good reasons. But we have a whole, even if we had a good eviction court data, which we don't, we're still missing the people who are not actually participating in the process, and that's a real problem. The lack of race data for evictions is a really big problem. In fact, it's both a huge problem in terms of we need to know, other than in isolated cities where it's been produced based on sampling mostly. We need to know that data, but it's also extremely difficult to find out because the landlord doesn't know what race people are. We don't really want them asking people what race they are. We don't want them guessing what race people are. The court doesn't know what race they are. The only person that knows is the tenant. And so there would have to be some part of the process where they were asked that question. And because of the way evictions processes go, that doesn't really happen in a lot of the way it happens. And so, you know, a lot of tenants don't even file answers. And so it's proved a very difficult problem to tackle at the same time that we're keenly aware of how much we need that information.
John, in your presentation, you mentioned a number of what appear to be serious due process problems with the way evictions are being done during the pandemic, both the kind of mass eviction process and the remote evictions. Have there been any legal challenges to how evictions are being done right now?
Yes, there have been a couple of challenges. In one case, the ACLU of, I think it might be Idaho, actually intervened in an eviction, some eviction defense cases where tenants were being evicted. They intervened and filed amicus briefs, which is something we've never really seen before at the state trial court level. I'm not exactly sure where that came out. There was one case filed in Virginia challenging some due process, the way that the court was conducting some of the due process concerns. And then there have been some about illegal CARES Act evictions. We have not seen as many of those cases yet as we would like to see. I think that everyone is scrambling right now to try to figure out, there's so much advocacy trying to on the court and on the governor to keep the moratorium going or to reinstate it, that trying to also intervene at the same time to stop the proceedings that are happening. It's a question of just everyone's resources being limited in terms of which way they're going. But I think as time continues to go on, we're going to see more of these lawsuits filed. It's also worth mentioning that we haven't yet seen the volume of evictions in most places that we were potentially expecting, but there are good reasons why we're not seeing it. One is the CARES Act money that came in April helped a lot of tenants make rent in April and May. And a lot of landlords are also not going to necessarily file for eviction on the very first month that someone's behind. So where we're really expecting to start seeing it is this month in July. This is the point where people are going to be 2 or 3 months behind, and we're really going to start, we think we're going to start to see the volume really go up in the places that don't have a moratoria. Even in the places that do, you know, we expect to see the filings go up because a lot of states are allowing the landlords to file the eviction even if it can't be heard. So we're going to be keeping a track of that. The Eviction Lab has for I think 12 cities, they're tracking how many evictions have been filed. So they have that on their website, but their numbers are a little. You have to take their numbers with a grain of salt because I think in one of the jurisdictions they're tracking, there's a moratorium in place, so we wouldn't expect there to be any filings or certainly not many. And in another one, they have sort of historically bad data. I think it's Texas. They have very little data historically about evictions because so little data is reported to them by the cities in Texas that they have a notoriously low eviction rate even before COVID. So what they report on as far as filings in Texas is not a particularly reliable figure.
We have about 4 minutes left, and I'd like to save 1 minute at the end for just the final slides for the audience, but I want to give each of the speakers a chance to give sort of a final thought, and I'll go just in the order of presentation. If there's anything that you'd like to leave the audience with, now would be a great time to share that. Sarah, is there any final thought that you'd like to leave the audience with today?
Just to thank everybody for all of their advocacy so far, and to let you know that you have a couple more weeks of this left, at least at the federal level. We're expecting a bill in the late July period, and so I want to just encourage you guys to keep doing the great work that you're doing, and now is really the time to be pressing as hard as we can on members of Congress to do what's right.
Thank you, Sarah. Amanda, any final thoughts for the audience?
Yeah, I would say ditto to Sarah, and then think about how we can use those resources in a racial equitable way and do the tough works. I mean, Sarah's doing tough work in Congress, then we need to do the tough work in our communities about having it's racially, anti-racist, explicit policies about those resources. And if there are funders on the line, like, we would not be here if it wasn't for grass tops policy, organizing, and all the policy and advocacy organizing in between. I know we're really laser focused on the programmatic implementation, but we can do both things. We can fund advocacy, we can fund organizing, we can fund equity analysis, and we can provide direct services. We have enough resources to do that. Let's do that, because it's really important work, and we need people pushing on the policy front.
Here, here. Thank you, Amanda. John, any final thought?
Yes, just that, again, on the remaining bold front, I think it's that there's going to be a tendency for a lot of communities to retrench right now and to say we've lost too much revenue, we can't do anything. The exact opposite is true. The situation is only going to get worse if they do nothing, and that includes their revenue. Their revenue is going to keep falling if we start seeing massive waves of homelessness hit these cities, and that would be a reason enough. But I think it's just the reminder has to just keep being, this is not a time to be conservative. This is not a time to be timid about our requests. This is the time that we need to be bold.
Agreed. Thank you, John, and thank you all of our presenters today. Rajan, I don't know if you have the final slides ready to go. I want to emphasize the call for working together, letting people with lived experience lead the charge. It's time to center racial equity, and it's time to be bold. I mean, that is the moment in time that we're in, and the consequences and stakes really could not be higher. There are ways that the Law Center is working on these issues, and one of the ways is through our Housing Not Handcuffs campaign. Please do consider endorsing that campaign. You can find out more about it at www.housingnothandcuffs.org. We already have 2,000 endorsements from individuals, organizations across the country that are demanding that housing be the solution to homelessness rather than use of the criminal justice system. We didn't really talk much about that today, but that's certainly implicated by all of the work that you've heard about today. You'll find a lot of resources on that website, as well as the endorsement statement. Please tweet at us, let us know, use our hashtag when you're doing work that is relevant to what we're discussing today. Feel free to contact us. Next slide, please. My contact info. Please do consider supporting the work. We are a nonprofit. We rely on donations. There is a way to donate. Again, you can access that link right on our website. And then the next slide, please, is my contact info. I'm a senior attorney at the National Law Center. We work at the intersection of housing and the criminal justice system to prevent and end homelessness. We work on a lot of other issues. I suppose I should say that's the intersection that I work on, but there are a lot of other things that we do at the Law Center. Please check out our website, check out the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign, and email me with any questions you have. I apologize, we had so many great questions. We didn't get to all of them, even with 90 minutes, but this was a great conversation. Thank you all for sticking around for an hour and a half, and I wish you all well moving forward. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.